And I want to begin just with a statement by Scott Turow, an American author. And what he says to us is, he says, who are we? But the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves and believe. Now, I want you to think about that just for a minute. Who are we but the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves and believe? We live our lives based upon the way we think of ourselves. And if you've never thought about this before, I'm going to invite you to think about this right now. Where do the ideas that you use to define your relationship to yourself, to your body, to other people, to the earth, to the past, to the future, to the cosmos, to God, to everything in your existence, where does that information come from? And what if that information is incorrect? Well, the stories we tell ourselves, that's what we're going to talk about tonight, because you and I are the product of a story. We have been steeped in a story in the Western world. If you were educated in the West in the last 150 years, you are the product of a story. And it's a big story. It is a story of competition, of conflict, of struggle. It's a story of human insignificance. We're told that we are the product of a random mutation, a series of mutations of genes that happened a long time ago. And that story, it's a very sterile sounding story, and it leaves us consciously and subconsciously. This is the key. Subconsciously, it leaves us with a feeling that we are helpless, that we are powerless, and that we are insignificant in life and insignificant in the world. I'm not saying that we talk about this consciously or that we're even aware of it consciously, but it plays out in our everyday lives. It plays out in the way we treat one another. It plays out in the way that we live our lives. So there's a new human story, and that's what I want to talk to you about right now. A new human story that's unfolding, and it is a beautiful story. It's a powerful story of hope and possibility. And here's why it's important. The key is that the better we know ourselves, the better equipped we are to deal with this new world. The better equipped we are to deal with whatever life brings to our doorstep. The better we know ourselves, the less we fear change in our world. I'm just going to get personal because I'm talking to you. So the better you know yourself, the less you fear change in your world. The better you know yourself, the less you fear other people that don't seem familiar and that have ways of thinking and living that are very, very different than what you have been led to believe are the way things should be in the world. The less we fear ourselves. And this is so important because we are such powerful beings and we are taught to subdue our power, to discount the power that we have, the power, as I mentioned, to self-regulate our own bodies, our immune systems, our longevity, our anti-aging enzymes, and the way our bodies function in the world. We are such powerful beings, but we're taught to fear that power, consciously and subconsciously. So as we go through this new material and the new discoveries that are simply not being shared in the mainstream, it changes the way we think about ourselves. There's a question, a single question that has been asked by every human that has ever walked the face of this earth, consciously or subconsciously. We ask this at different points in our lives for different reasons in our lives. And the question is simply this. You probably already know what it is. The question is simply, who am I as an individual? And there are many of us on this planet now. We share the planet with almost 8 billion people. So the question becomes, who are we? Who are we? That means different things, different people, but I want you to know that the reason that we're having this conversation, this is much more than a philosophical question. You know, it's an interesting question, and you could sit down over a latte at Starbucks and spend hours talking about this, but it's much, much more than that. The answer to what I'm asking you goes right to the core of the very issues that are polarizing our families, shredding our communities. They're dividing our societies, and they're even polarizing our nations. More than a philosophical question, it matters. This question matters for these reasons, because you and I, we live our lives, we solve our problems, choose our relationships, we heal our bodies based upon the way we think about ourselves. Now, if you've never thought about that before, I want you to consider that just for a moment. You solve your problems based upon the way you think about yourself. Do you see yourself as part of or separate from the world? Do you feel that you're qualified to solve the problems that come into your life day by day? Your relationships, think about the relationships that you invite into your life. We're adults. Let's just do this. Think about the people that you invite into your bed. That is one of the most intimate relationships that you will ever have. Who do you invite into your bed? Who do you invite into your life? Who do you invite as your friends? The answer to all these questions, it's based upon the way you feel about yourself. It's based upon your self-worth, your self-esteem, you know that, but it goes even deeper. It's based upon what you have been taught to believe about your very existence. And that is what is about to change. That's why this is so important. You know, the hate that we're seeing in the world today, much of it is based upon beliefs that we all have been steeped in the past, but are simply not true. And this is the danger. This is the danger of perpetuating false science in the classrooms and in the textbooks. You know, it's one thing to have a scientific belief when we all think it's true. When we find out it's not true, to perpetuate and continue teaching that belief. I think that is where the fault really comes in when it comes to what's happening in our lives today. So if you look at the issues, the deepest issues that are dividing us as a society today, domestic abuse, sexual abuse, drug abuse, religious persecution, brutality, hate. Think about the hate based upon the color of our skin, the hate based upon our sexual orientation, the hate based upon our religion, the cyberbullying that's happening with our young people in schools today. You know, the studies are very clear. They're showing that young people, many young people, receive the cyberbullying. The way they respond to it is determined by the way they've been taught to think about themselves in their families. Now think about that. When a family is conscious enough to imbue within the young people the deep truths that tell them that they are connected to themselves, they're connected to their own bodies, that nature is their friend. Nature is based upon cooperation, not competition. That they live in a world where this cooperation is the fundamental rule. When they have a rock solid understanding, a knowing, a deep knowing of who they are, when that cyberbullying happens, it rolls right off of them because they don't believe it. It's our young people who are lost, who don't know who they are, who do not have that rock solid foundation, that they're not receiving it in their homes. They're not receiving it from their friends. So when the peers begin to bully them through the social media, they don't know any better, and they believe it to the degree that some of them are even taking their own lives because they feel they have no worth on this planet. This is much more than a philosophical conversation, and we're just scratching the surface here. This is some of the reason why. You know, death penalty, suicide, assisted suicide, all of these ideas, as different as they are from one another, the answer, the common theme to all of them, and the answer to dealing with them all lies in the way we answer this single question: who am I as an individual? Who are we collectively? Rachel Carson was an author back in the early 1960s. And I remember when she was writing the books about DDT. I was raised in 1950s, 1960s, my childhood. And at that point, DDT was a pesticide that was being used to eradicate mosquitoes. I remember living in northern Missouri. The DDT trucks would come up and down our street in the summer months, the humid months of June, July, and August. And they would spray a cloud of DDT to kill the mosquitoes. And I remember my neighbors, the kids, would run behind the trucks and they'd play in the cloud of DDT because they thought it was fun. I didn't do it. Something inside told me that it wasn't a good thing to do, and I never did it. But Rachel Carson came out against this in the book Silent Spring. She was one of the first environmentalists. And what she said in that time rings so true today, and I want to share it with you right now. She said, we destroy what we don't value, and we cannot value what we don't know. We only destroy the things that we don't value, and we can't value what we don't know. Now, I'm saying this to you now because human life is being devalued, and it's being destroyed at an unprecedented rate, and you and I know it because it's happening right in front of our faces. It's happening on television, it's happening on YouTube, it's happening in our schools, in our churches, in our communities. Anything that we do other than going to the core issues is simply a Band-Aid when it comes to dealing with this kind of an issue. It's good to pass laws. I think the laws are important. The Hate Crimes Act of 2009 certainly is an important law. but it doesn't stop the thinking of those who are committing the crimes. And if we're honest with ourselves, you and I know that. So to go to the root of where this thinking comes from, that is the key to really solving the problems. If we're going to create the kind of world we know is possible, we've got to change the way we think about ourselves. So when we ask the question, who are we? What I want to say is new discoveries are changing the way that we answer that question. Let me share a couple of them with you right now. You're probably seeing on your screen, you should be seeing an atom. This is an old model of an atom. Maybe you saw this when you were in school. It's certainly what I was taught when I was in school. It's things moving around a thing, okay? Electrons moving around a nucleus. This is what we were taught. But now we know an atom doesn't look like this anymore. Now we know an atom is not things moving around things. It is a field of energy, a field of energy that is pulsing and vibrating in place rather than things moving around things. So as sure as scientists were 50 years ago, they thought they knew what an atom looked like. Now they have to change their thinking. The atom doesn't look like that anymore. When I was in school and when you were in school, we were taught that nature is based upon competition, conflict, and struggle. And you probably remember this. We were taught Darwin's words that we live in a world, survival of the strongest. And those are actually Darwin's words, survival of the strongest, later changed to survival of the fittest. But survival of the strongest. We were told that we live in a dog-eat-dog world. We know that that's not true. The best science of the 21st century is now telling us that we live in a world based upon cooperation and what biologists call mutual aid. Now, we're going to be honest with ourselves. We all see competition and conflict. We're not denying that it exists, but here's the deal. The more competition, the more conflict you see in any species, that tells you how far that species has strayed from the deepest truths of its relationship with the fundamental aspects of nature. And that goes for humans as well. The more conflict we see among us, it tells us how far we are off the mark. That's why it's so hard to find true harmony in our world and in our society, because we have strayed from these truest laws of nature. Science is telling us much, much more now. Now we know we are born to self-regulate. We are born to rejuvenate. Your body is designed to regenerate. I want you to think about this. Two ways of thinking about life. One way is that you come into the world as a vessel. You think of yourself as a vessel with X amount of life that you begin to use over time, slowly and gradually over time, okay? It's one way of thinking. There's another way of thinking, and the science is supporting this now. We come into this world as a vessel of life, X amount of life, and as we go through our lives, we constantly replenish and rejuvenate that life. It is not something that we use up slowly, gradually over time. It is something that we have the potential, the capacity to keep adding to over time. You and I were taught that evolution is our story. We're taught that we are the product of a long, slow, gradual process that led to primitive forms of life that changed over time and evolved ultimately until us. You're seeing us encircled at the top of what's called the evolutionary family tree here. And what I want to say to you tonight, what we're going to do tonight is I'm going to share with you why this story is not true. The evidence no longer supports this story. This story is breaking down. I want to talk about me a little bit. I was doing a radio program recently about this very topic. I have a new book entitled Human by Design. I was doing an interview. And the interviewer, the first thing he said when he came on, he says, Greg, what gives you the right to talk about evolution? He said, you're only an earth scientist. You're only a geologist. He said, how can you possibly talk about evolution? And I listened to him and I said, I understand your question. And I asked the interviewer, I said, do you know what the profession was of the man that created the theory of evolution? Do you know what Charles Darwin's profession was? And he said, no. And I said, well, he was a geologist, just like me. And the interviewer said, okay, let's go to a station break. So they immediately went to a station break. They came back and never said another word. So I want to be really clear. I'm a scientist. I'm a degreed geologist. I have a strong background in the life sciences, in invertebrate biology, vertebrate biology, paleontology, molecular biology. And that has helped me to delve into the hardcore peer-reviewed scientific journals so that I can find those new discoveries. so that I can bring them together in a way that's meaningful and accessible to a broad general audience that may not be so technically oriented. I think science is good. I want to be very clear, science does not have all the answers. Science is incomplete. It's a relatively young way of thinking. It's only about 300 years old. So science, as good as it is incomplete. There are glaring gaps and inconsistencies, and you're going to see some of those tonight. The other thing, and I have to say this, in many respects, science has been hijacked in the modern world. It's been hijacked by corporations, by politics, by religion. People are cherry picking the data to support their agenda. So I think it's important to be honest with ourselves that this is happening, to acknowledge that and cut through all of that and honor ourselves with the facts. So I'm going to share what I have found to be factually substantiated in the scientific work. And when I share my personal opinion, I'm going to tell you, I'm going to say, hey, this isn't science. This is a Greggism. It's Gregg's personal opinion. For the most part, I'm going to stay with the science. That's where we're going to go right now. Evolution, excuse me, evolution isn't our story. First discovery. This is Charles Darwin, 1859. He wrote a book entitled The Origin of Species. The book was written in 1859, or published in 1859. He actually wrote it 20 years earlier. But he did not publish during that time because he knew he was going to catch a lot of flack from the church and from the status quo. So he waited 20 years to publish. Charles Darwin said that evolution is what has led to our existence. I want to be clear, as a geologist, evolution is a fact. I've seen it in the fossil record for some forms of life, for some plants and for some animals. Evolution breaks down when it comes to humans. It's a fact, just not for us. So I thought I'd begin by identifying what it is we're talking about. What is evolution? If you're not familiar with it, with your permission, I'd like to share with you evolution in 58 seconds. Are you okay with that? Okay, I hear everybody yelling yes. So 58 seconds. Charles Darwin did not attempt to tell us where life came from. His focus was on what happened after life began as very simple organisms. So he said a long time ago, life began as very simple organisms. And as the environment changed, the organism had to change to survive in the environment. So the organism became more complex. The organism began to adapt new elements of its existence. Maybe it grew fins, maybe it grew lungs, maybe it learned a new way to eat so it could survive. But here's the key. The changes happen slowly, gradually over long periods of time. That's the hallmark of evolution, slow, gradual changes over a long period of time. And Darwin said that this continued and the life became more and more complex until it led to us, to us humans. That was the theory. But I want to show you something really interesting because even Darwin had doubts about his own theory. He said if it's true, we should see evidence of these different forms of life in the fossil record. But Darwin has a very flowery way of speaking. This is 150 years ago, but I want you to see in his language, I'm going to share his language, look at how he expressed his doubt. Look at what he said. Darwin said, why does not every collection of fossil remains afford plain evidence of the gradation and the mutation of the forms of life? He's saying, okay, I'm just going to paraphrase. He's saying, hey, if this is true, how come I don't see all of this evidence in the fossil record? He goes on to say, we meet with no such evidence. And this is the most obvious and forcible of the many objections which may be urged against my theory. So he himself is saying, we don't find the evidence that my theory is suggesting should exist, and then this is a problem. So I just want you to see, Darwin had his own doubts. The question has always been, how do we get from the primitive forms of life, how do we get from there to the more complex forms that we see today? The primitive on your screen is on the lower left-hand side, the more complex, modern human is on the right. How do we get from one step to another, to another, to another? Well, the theory of evolution goes like this. It says that once the primates evolved, that the evolution continued, and we went from less evolved to more evolved forms of life until we end up with something like you see on your screen today, something like a modern human. That's the theory. All right, so we're saying that Darwin's idea of evolution, slow, gradual change over a long period of time. Now, other theories have come along, punctuated evolution, Stephen Jay Gould, for those of you familiar with him. I'm going to acknowledge that in just a few minutes. But what I'm saying is these ideas of Darwin's are not supported by the evidence. Darwin said we went from primate to human through this long, slow, gradual process. But what you're seeing on your screen right now is called the evolutionary family tree for humans. You've probably seen something like it before. Modern humans are in the upper left-hand corner. We are in the red circle, that's us. All the other skulls that you see are fossilized remains that have been found that are believed to represent the stages that led to us. Here's the problem. You can look on your screen closely. Can you see the green lines that connect us with those other forms of life? First of all, I want you to find those. Can you see how those green lines are not solid lines? They're broken lines. They're dashed lines. And most of them around us, they have a question mark somewhere in those lines. The reason that they are dashed is actually shown in the legend on this chart. I'm going to enhance this for you. These green lines represent what are called inferred or speculative relationships. There is no evidence to support them that has been found to this day. However, they are believed to exist. And because they are believed to exist, they are plotted on the evolutionary family tree, as we see right here. Now, I've spoken with friends of mine, in the university system who are friends only until we have this conversation. And then for a little while, the friendship has a hard time. And I asked them, I said, why is it? Tell me this. If we're on the right track in this thinking of evolution, after 150 plus years since Darwin introduced his theory, with the best minds of the world, the best universities, the most sophisticated equipment, the greatest amounts of money that have been put to support the research, why aren't we further along in finding the evidence that supports this theory? Wouldn't we have found something more by this time? And my friends, all they say to me is, Greg, we just haven't looked in the right place. So we need to keep looking. Job security. We need to keep looking. So the problem with this is a theory, and it is a theory that works for other forms of life. I want to be really clear. It just breaks down when it comes to us. The problem is it is taught as absolute fact in the classroom, and any ideas, even if they're scientific ideas that compete with this, they're not being taught. Are we the product of evolution as we see on this tree? The evidence doesn't support it, and that's where I'm going to go next. Discovery number 2. If it was only about the physical evidence, I couldn't have this conversation with you. But in the last few years, only recently, it is the DNA evidence. The DNA evidence is telling a story that scientists can't argue with. And the story tells us that our DNA today did not come from the DNA of those beings that are supposed to be our ancestors. We did not descend from those beings. Let me show you what I mean. Now, science has reached a point where science fiction has become science fact. And one of the places we're seeing this, here's what I mean by this. I think you all probably saw the movie Jurassic Park, an amazing movie. Where did those ideas even come from? Well, in the movie Jurassic Park, DNA was extracted from the fossilized remains of ancient forms of life, of dinosaurs. And the DNA was reconstituted so that they could bring the dinosaurs back to life. Now, to the best of my knowledge, this hasn't quite happened with humans yet, to the best of my knowledge. But here's what has happened. We are able to extract the DNA from the fossilized remains of the beings that are supposed to be our ancestors. We can build their genome and compare their DNA, their genome, to ours today as modern humans. That's giving us the new story. That's what's telling the new story. So this all began in 1987 in Northern Europe. The remains of a baby Neanderthal girl were found. Now, I'm assuming you all know, you've studied in school, that Neanderthal is supposed to be one of the forms of life that we have descended from, that Neanderthal is our ancestor. This discovery has changed that thinking, but it's simply not being shared commonly in the mainstream. So this baby Neanderthal girl, she was carbon dated to about 30,000 years before present. And she was preserved so well. What you're seeing are portions of her ribs. They were preserved so well that the DNA from inside of her ribs was able to be extracted. They could build the genome and compare her DNA to ours. The discovery was made in 1987. The results were not announced until the year 2000, in the year 2000. And in the year 2000, a very prestigious journal, Nature, volume 404, March 30th, the year 2000, page 490. I know you don't want to see the whole paper, so I'm going to cut to the last sentence of the last paragraph of the conclusion. And it is a quote, and here's what it says. Quote, the results suggest that modern human was not, in fact, descended from Neanderthals. So now we know who we're not. As a matter of fact, since that discovery was published, scientists now know that we shared the earth with Neanderthals. We walked the earth with them. They say we probably interbred with them. We had Neanderthal boyfriends and girlfriends. If we walked the earth with them, we could not have descended from them. And now we know that Neanderthal is not our ancestor. We did not descend from Neanderthal. Now, some people have Neanderthal DNA, that's true. A little bit because of the interbreeding. But there's not enough to show that, that they are actually our ancestors, that we have descended from them. That leads to discovery number 3. Who are we? Well, if you studied Neanderthal, you probably also discovered and studied something called, at the time you and I were in school. Now, I'm going to clarify, I was in the school in 1950s, 1960s, early 1970s is when I was in school. And at that time, there was another form of life called Cro-Magnon that was discussed, usually with Neanderthal. That term is now obsolete. It is no longer used. Cro-Magnon has been replaced with another term, and if you haven't seen this, you're going to love it. It's on your screen right now. Anatomically modern human, or AMH is the acronym, the first letter of each of the words that you see there in red. Anatomically modern humans. We can compare the DNA from anatomically modern humans to ours today, and what scientists are telling us, now this is key, I want you to listen closely to what I'm going to say. Anatomically modern humans showed up on Earth 200,000 years ago and have not changed in 200,000 years. Now, what does that mean? Anatomically modern humans showed up and they haven't changed. They're still here. Who are they? They are us. We are they. We are the anatomically modern humans. We showed up on Earth 200,000 years ago. The DNA hasn't changed. For all intents and purposes, if you put an anatomically modern human next to a modern human today, like you're seeing on your screen, you can't tell us apart. Bone structure is the same. Cranial capacity is the same. Body proportions are the same. This is what they look like. They don't look that much different than modern humans are today. I thought I'd choose humans that we all know. And if you don't know that human, I put another one in there. Maybe you know this one, just to be fair. The point is, and there is a point, that anatomically modern humans appeared mysteriously 200,000 years ago. They did not evolve from these other forms of life. Now, Charles Darwin, this is his own words. Once again, I want you to listen to this. He said, if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications. Remember, that's the hallmark of evolution. Slow change gradually over long periods of time. He's saying if there was any organ that was formed that did not happen through numerous successive slight modifications, look at what he says, my theory would absolutely break down. He's talking about single organs. Now we have an entire being, anatomically modern human, showed up suddenly. It was not the process from numerous successive slight modifications. And I'm going to get right into the DNA, and I want to show you what it is that happened. But Darwin was willing for his theory to fall. He was okay with it. It's modern academics, modern universities, some scientists that are not willing for this theory to fall, even though the evidence no longer supports the theory. So now here's what we're looking at. The traditional tree of evolution looks like this. Here we are, in the red circle in the upper left-hand corner. The new tree looks like this. We're no longer at the top of that tree on the left because we are not the product of that evolution. We showed up suddenly. Our tree looks more like a bush. It is one event. We showed up 200,000 years ago. There appears to be no evolutionary path leading to us. Now, I don't know what happened. I have my personal suspicions, but as a scientist, I'm sharing with you, this is where the evidence is right now. So what scientists have to say, modern humans appeared suddenly 200,000 years ago. That is pretty much accepted in scientific circles. They know that. Two big questions. How did it happen and why did it happen? Science cannot tell us the why, because that would entail the scientists getting into the mind or the mind of nature or the mind of whatever it is that was responsible for what's happening. Science can't tell us the why. Science can tell us the nuts and the bolts, the mechanism of how. This is where the DNA gets even more interesting. So hang on to your seat for this one. Discovery number 4. Discovery number 4, the mystery of human chromosome number 7. Now, if you're not familiar with human chromosomes, I want to put this little overlay. The chromosomes contain long strands of DNA, and along the strands of DNA are shorter pieces of DNA that are called genes, okay? So small pieces of DNA are the genes that form along the larger portions of the DNA that we call the chromosomes in the human body. Here's why this is important. I'm going to show you a schematic of human chromosome number 7. This is what it looks like. You can see there's a little pinch out place offset to the left. The short leg is called the P leg or the P arm, and the long arm is called the Q arm. This is consistent throughout all of the chromosomes. And there's a gene, there are many genes on here. The black bands and the white bands, those are the genes. What I want you to see is where the yellow arrow is, 7q31.1. This is gene 7q31.1. That's very complex sounding. It's also called the FOXP2 gene. That's much easier. FOXP2 gene. Why is that important? Look at what the FOXP2 gene does. It's because we have the FOXP2 gene in the configuration that we have it, that changes in the brain that make complex speech and language possible, are possible. So, you know, I'm a musician. When I'm not doing the work I'm doing right now as a musician, I've always wondered, chimpanzees, they share 98% of our DNA. How come we don't hear chimpanzees singing Stairway to Heaven? You know, and you're not going to hear it. Chimpanzees don't sing. Why is that? It's because their FOXP2 gene is configured differently than ours. And here's where it gets really, really interesting. The mutation that happened that allows us complex speech. There was a little transposition, a little switch of DNA letters that occurred that enabled the connection between our tongue and our mouth and our muscles and our jaws and a certain part of our brain. Look at this, it happened rapidly at the time language emerged in humans, and this is from the David Geffen School of Medicine, UCLA. Didn't happen slowly, gradually over a long period of time. Look at this, the mutations that make our complex language possible happened in the same time when modern humans emerged 200,000 years ago. That's from the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology. So, chromosome number 7, the change in the FOXP2, it happened quickly. It happened exactly when we were appearing 200,000 years ago. How did it happen? Well, if we go in and look at some other DNA, it's going to tell us the story. This leads to discovery number 5. Discovery number 5 is another chromosome, human chromosome number 2. And I'm laying this out. This first module, I want to share with you why we have the uniqueness that we have. Next module, we're not going to do any of this. We're going to go into the relationships between the heart and the brain and what these chromosomes and the DNA configurations make possible for us. But I wanted you to see what it is that makes this possible. So that's why I'm doing this the way I'm doing it. Human chromosome number 2. It's a big chromosome. It's the second largest in your body. It makes up about 8% of every one of your cells. It has over 1,200 genes, and I'm going to talk only about one. One gene on human chromosome number 2 is largely responsible for you and me and the uniqueness, what it is that gives us our humanness. It is a gene that is called TBR1. TBR1 is responsible for our brain 50% larger from our nearest primate relatives, a chimp or an ape or orangutan. It's responsible for the neocortex. It's responsible for the frontal lobe and the occipital lobe and the temporal lobe and the parietal lobes. In our brain, it is responsible for empathy, sympathy, compassion, self-regulation throughout our bodies. This all comes from TBR1, gene TBR1, that is found in human chromosome number 2. So now you can see this is a very important chromosome. Without it, we would not be here today having this conversation. So important. My question is, where did it come from? So I put this diagram up just so you can see. If you look on the right-hand side of the screen, everything you see in green, about half of the brain, that is from gene TBR1, the changes that it initiated, and human chromosome number 2 allows this to be as it is. The neocortex, rational thoughts, self-regulation, language, morality, logic, empathy, sympathy, compassion, all the things that we just mentioned, is all part of what you see happening in the green part of the brain that you're seeing there. It all comes from human chromosome number 2. Once I understood that, I said, wow, that's a very important chromosome. No other form of life has it. Where did we get ours? How did we get this most important chromosome? The answer to that question is in another technical paper. It's on your screen right now, the Proceedings from the National Academy of Sciences. The volume is called Genetics. Once again, this is a technical paper. I'm going to cut to the conclusion and to the last couple of sentences of the conclusion. And then we're going to talk about this, and we can actually do some Q&A around this. Look at what it says. Quote, "We conclude that chromosome 2 is the relic of an ancient telomere to telomere fusion," I'll tell you what that is in just a minute, "of 2 ancestral ape chromosomes." So it's saying there were 2 pre-existing chromosomes. They were fused together in a very precise way. Now, many people say, well, this means that we descended from the primates. It doesn't mean that, and you're going to see why in just a moment. But I want you just to get this first part. It's the relic, chromosome 2, that gives us our humanness. It is the result of an ancient fusion of 2 pre-existing chromosomes that happened. Now look at what happened after. This is the key. After the fusion happened, the fusion was followed by the elimination of overlapping functions, as well as by events that stabilize the fusion. Okay, these are scientists in scientific language telling us what happened. Now I'm going to share it with you in my language. 2 fully functional pre-existing chromosomes, they merged, okay? When they merged, where they both had functions, they were overlapping, and there were places where they were counterproductive. So look at what happened. Those places were either shut down, turned off, removed altogether. One of those 3 things happened to stabilize that fusion. And this is where it gets really interesting, because evolution doesn't do this. This is not the product of evolution. Let me just show you, here's a picture of what happened. So you're seeing on the left, you're seeing 2 ancient chromosomes. They're whole and complete. They're the little blue bars. There's a red section called a centromere in the middle of each. And the telomeres are specialized DNA, and you see them only on the ends. Once the fusion happened, what used to be on the ends now is in the center of the result. Can you see that? Can you see the blue that is in the center underneath where it says fusion? That is our human chromosome 2. But look at this. Because they both had centromeres, okay, and I'm showing you those on the red portion of the diagram there. One of those centromeres, number 1, was actually disengaged. It was disabled. This is not the product of evolution. This is why I'm sharing this with you, and that's the most technical that I'm going to get tonight. Here's a picture of what it actually looks like. You can actually see human chromosome number 2 on the left, that little skinny part that I've highlighted with the red circle. That is where the fusion occurred. Some people don't like those diagrams, so I thought I'd give you a little movie. Here's another movie showing you the same thing. Look at what happened. What it's saying is that 2 fully functional pieces of DNA, they came together. Some pieces were disabled, some were enabled, some pieces removed, some pieces were added to make human chromosome number 2 as it is today. Now, here's why this is important. Scientists say the timing of this, it did not happen slowly, gradually over a long period of time, as evolution would suggest. It happened, boom, 200,000 years ago when we appeared. The precision of disabling and removing and adding very specific pieces of the DNA, and the end result giving us the neocortex, all the green part of the brain, the end result giving us our humanness, empathy, sympathy, compassion, self-regulation, emotion, complex speech, all of that suggests something beyond evolution. Scientists are acknowledging this. They say this is more than evolution could do, and they have to stop there. Science must stop here because they cannot tell us what goes any further. However, behind the closed doors, and I've been in conferences where they're having these conversations, the forbidden language is now emerging because this appears to be beyond evolution. It suggests an intentionality. It suggests that there was something intentional that created these very precise changes very quickly in one period of time that have led to us. And if there is an intention, that suggests a purpose. It suggests that we are intended to awaken these extraordinary capabilities that exist within our being. So what are the odds this could have happened by chance? People ask me this all the time. So I'm going to take just a minute and I'm going to share this with you. What are the odds? A former head of Utah State University, Frank Salisbury, he said the odds are pretty steep, about 1 in 10 to the 600th. That's a big number. If you're not familiar with that number, it happens to be a British unit of measurement called a centillion. So the odds are 1 to a centillion. And if you don't know what that looks like, I'm going to be quiet just for a second so you can see a little movie of a centillion on your screens, the bandwidth to let this happen here. So this is what a centillion looks like. And it goes on and on. The number you're seeing on your screen is a big number. The odds of the DNA forming randomly through random mutations are 1 to that number. And if you're not in the math and that just looks like a bunch of zeros to you, there's another way to do it. I love this. English astrophysicist Sir Fred Hoyle, he said that the odds of even DNA in general, just DNA, not even the specifics, but just DNA molecule forming, he said the odds of that happening are about the equivalent of a tornado sweeping through a junkyard, and as it leaves the junkyard, leaving behind a 747. Boeing 747, the odds of the DNA molecule forming are the equivalent to a tornado sweeping through a junkyard and assembling a Boeing 747. And you and I know that's not going to happen. That's how steep the odds are. Something else has happened here. But the question is, if something else happened, who or why? Who's responsible? Why did it happen? This is where the story comes in. Depends on who you ask. I toured with Zecharia Sitchin, who wrote the books about the ancient Sumerians in the 1990s before he died. The ancient Sumerians, they had their story about how this emergence of humanity happened. The Aboriginals in Australia traced their DNA back over 60,000 years. They've got their story about how we've emerged. You're looking at part of their creation story on your screen right now. The Navajo in the American Desert Southwest, they're my neighbors right here in my backyard. They've got their story. The ancient Hindus, they have a beautiful story. The Egyptians, they've got their story about creation and how humankind emerged. Christians have their story with beautiful pictures about how this emergence occurred. The ancient Hebrew traditions, they've got a story. It's a little different from the Christian story about how we emerged. Science has had a story for 150 years that's called evolution, about how science believes that humankind has emerged. If you watch much television, History Channel has got their story. Ancient Aliens, they've got a story about what they believe is responsible for our existence. If you're seeing some of the artifacts come out from very ancient places being excavated in the Western Hemisphere, you're seeing another story that is actually engraved upon the artifacts themselves. That's a story. And I just shared with you another story. I shared with you a story that the DNA is sharing right now. All right, so science has reached a point where they are in forbidden territory. They're telling us what happened. They cannot tell us why it happened. What I'm interested in for you right now, and me, is where do we go with this? We ask the question, who are we? And what I can say to you, in all honesty, is you are absolutely not what you have been told, and you are more, so much more than probably you've ever even allowed yourself to imagine.